Let the word go forth from this time and place to friend and foe alike.
This is preeminently the time to speak the truth, the whole truth, frankly and boldly.
History doesn't have to be boring, buttoned up, or inaccessible. And it certainly didn't end in 1945. It belongs to all of us, and we share and add to it every day. Welcome to the History A Go-Go podcast, where I interview interesting guests, cover a motley crew of topics, and it's a place where you can sit, think, and drink all at the same time. I'm your host, Rob Mellon.
Since you're attacking us, can you give us a question? Mr. President-elect.
Go ahead.
Mr. President-elect, since you are attacking our news organization, can you give us a chance?
Your organization
You are attacking our news organization. Can you give us a chance to ask a question, sir?
Go ahead.
Sir, can you state, Mr. President-elect,
go ahead.
Can you state categorically,
she's asking a question.
Mr. President-elect, can you give us a question?
Don't be
You're
rude.
attacking us. Can you give us a question?
Don't be rude.
Can you give us a question?
I'm not going to give you a question.
Can you state categorically?
You are fake news.
Sir,
go ahead.
Can you state categorically that nobody... No, Mr. President-elect, that's not appropriate.
My guest today is one of the country's leading authorities on Abraham Lincoln, writer and lecturer Harold Holzer. He was the winner of the 2015 Gilder Lehrman Lincoln Prize, served for many years as the chairman of the Lincoln Bicentennial Foundation, and currently serves as the chairman of the Lincoln Forum. He has been a frequent guest on radio and TV, including the History Channel, CNN, Fox News, the PBS NewsHour, and he's appeared more than 125 times on C-SPAN. Holzer is a prolific writer and researcher, having authored, co-authored, or edited 54 books, including Monument Man, The Life and Art of Daniel Chester French, Lincoln and the Power of the Press, The War for Public Opinion, and Lincoln at Cooper Union, the speech that made Abraham Lincoln president. His most recent work is The Presidents versus the Press, the endless battle between the White House and the media, from the Founding Fathers to fake news. Of the book, The Washington Post writes, a lively, deeply researched history of the roller coaster relationships between the presidents and journalists, from George Washington to Donald Trump. Holzer recounts all this and much more in considerable colorful detail. And we are very pleased to have the Lincoln scholar and writer with us today. Welcome, Mr. Holzer.
It's good to be with you.
Now, one of the themes of your book appears to be that this adversarial relationship between the U.S. presidents and the press, that's not new.
It's as old as the presidency itself. Less one term, I would say, or 3 years. I would say that George Washington had a 3-year extended honeymoon during which he was lauded in most newspapers, just as he had been as the hero of the revolution. But 3 years into his first term, enough dissent began between Democratic Republicans who were more loyal to Jeffersonian ideals and to Jefferson himself. And the Federalists, well, Jefferson himself urged a pro-democratic newspaper editor to move to Philadelphia, then the national capital, to relocate there from New York, and there to start basically an anti-Washington newspaper. Think of Secretary of State Tony Blinken asking Fox News to step up its anti-Biden coverage. That was the equivalent. It was the first cabinet, and nobody ever thought to say, gee, the cabinet members should be loyal to the president. So that's when it began. And then, especially during his second term, Washington was just mercilessly bombarded, and he didn't like it, I will add. He was not used to that kind of criticism, personal and political.
Harold, it is tradition here to accompany the conversation with a special brew. Today we have Freedom of Press Session Sour with Black Currants from Revolution Brewery of Chicago, Illinois. Freedom of Press is an easy-drinking, fruit-flavored beer with a lightly tart character and dry finish. And the black currants give it its signature pink-purple hue. What a beautiful hue it is. The original recipe was created at their brewpub location and quickly became a favorite among Revolution's patrons. Remember, the best way to enjoy the podcast is with one of our featured brews. This is also my time to ask you to subscribe to the podcast. Simply hit that subscribe button on the directory that you use and get the newest material right away. And to all the listeners and supporters from 1,000 cities around the globe and, of course, across America, I have to say thank you. And now I raise my freedom of press session sour very high. And to the reporters, newspaper men and women, and journalists who are not afraid to speak truth to power, not even in front of the leader of the free world. I say exercise your freedom, and cheers. So the Sedition Act, which was signed in 1798 by John Adams, is often pointed to throughout history as one of the most egregious attacks on the First Amendment right of the freedom of the press. I'm not going to justify Adams' actions, but to put it into context, what impact do you think that the horrors of the French Revolution and the Reign of Terror, which would have been just a few years prior to that,
Right.
did that have any impact on his decision, or is this just blatant Federalist partisanship?
Well, I think it owed most to partisanship. I think it was, and it was absolutely, unquestionably unconstitutional. The amendment says Congress may make no law abridging freedom of expression, either speech or press. And Congress did pass a law. I mean, it is not as gray an area as the ones I'm sure we'll explore in our conversation regarding Lincoln and Wilson and Roosevelt and Obama and others. And now, as we've just learned in recent weeks, Donald Trump. So, yeah, I'm sure there was genuine fear of the excesses of the French Revolution. But in fairness, the American Revolution was over. It may have inspired the French Revolution. It may have failed to limit the revolutionary aspect of the French Revolution and the bloody aspects of it. But I think it would be hard to make an argument that it was justifiable in terms of enacting a clearly unconstitutional law, which, by the way, George Washington said from retirement he thought was great and would have supported had he been president, except that it didn't quite go far enough. So there you go. And remember another thing. The idea of the act is that it brought so-called seditious editors into federal court if they were charged with sedition under this new law. But think of the federal court. We think today's court, or at least today's Supreme Court, is out of whack, perhaps. But the federal court of the United States at the time of the Sedition Act was 100% exclusively Federalist, because only George Washington and John Adams had appointed judges.
Right.
So I think it guarantees a political result to the decisions of the court, which, by the way, went all against Democratic editors in the cases that were brought.
You seem to make a point to bring up many of the founding fathers in your book. I think you include, if I did the count right, about 19 of all of the presidents.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Regarding Thomas Jefferson, though, we spoke about him briefly in reference to the press and George Washington, but I'm interested in that curious case of James Callender.
Right. That is curious. So shall I briefly as I'm able, with my tendency to go too long, describe this episode?
Please.
Okay. So James Callender was a pro-Democratic editor from Richmond, Virginia, who praised all things Jefferson and wrote terrible things about George Washington. And when the 12 years of Federalist rule ended in 1809, a month after Lincoln was born, as it happened, Callender asked Jefferson for the reward that he thought was due. He was struggling to feed a large family and a large alcohol habit as well, by the way. And he wanted to be postmaster of Richmond. That was not a big deal, I think. You know, federal patronage was already happening. The Democrats were in charge for the first time in the country's history. They were going to get rid of all the Federalists in federal offices and appoint Democrats. And of course, I'm saying Democrats, meaning Democratic Republicans.
Right.
Just as shorthand.
Democratic Republicans, sure.
Right. But there was something about Callender's ask or about Callender himself that Jefferson didn't like. And he wrote to people that he didn't like his presumption, his whatever. And he said no. Suddenly, James Callender became a Federalist newspaper man and spent the rest of his life, not long, attacking Jefferson and Jeffersonian policies. But most consequentially, he wrote a pamphlet announcing to the world that Thomas Jefferson had made a common law wife of his enslaved servant, Sally Hemings. and very tauntingly wrote, there are a number of red-headed African Americans, and of course he didn't say it in polite terms, running around Monticello as the fruit of that liaison. It's interesting that most people didn't believe it at the time, but it certainly has come back, been proven by my friend Annette Gordon-Reed, and accepted even by the Jefferson descendants, who now meet at Monticello, black as well as white, to talk about their common and fraught history. But he really gave it to Jefferson for his failure to reward him. And I simply point out that in an era in which these kinds of payoffs with jobs was part of the culture, he really made a foolish mistake in not giving the guy the reward that he felt he was entitled to by loyalty alone.
Regarding the imperial nature of Andrew Jackson's presidency and his use of executive power, and this, of course, led to a real hatred of Jackson by many. Now, the Whig Party, it formed for, I guess, many reasons, but the largest being an opposition to this one man.
Yes.
How did Jackson handle the ugly nature of that invective? He doesn't seem like the type of guy that would take harsh criticism very well.
No, he wasn't. And if he reminds you of a recent American president in the way he handled criticism and then dished it out, even as he took it, it's I think a reasonable comparison, just, not talking about policy, but talking about nature. And Jackson gave back as good as he got. And what he did is he did give favors to Democratic Jacksonian newspapermen. He gave them printing contracts. He gave them official scoops, made them the official organs of his administration. And even more impactfully, he created what we know now as the kitchen cabinet, which meant that rather than the official cabinet confirmed by the Senate, with whom he had become bored and displeased because of their high-handed rejection of a woman named Peggy Eaton, but that's a long story. He began to welcome, through the back door, through the kitchen entrance of the White House, a group of advisors, most of whom were big-time Jacksonian editors. So he created the first informal advisory network in the White House, really the likes of which we're not seeing again until the Roosevelt era, Theodore Roosevelt, and really until the 20th century. And the Jacksonian press was as full of invective for John Quincy Adams and John Calhoun and Henry Clay as the anti-Jackson press was for Jackson. So it was really a roiling time, and it set the stage for future moments in American history, including today's, when the press is almost totally lined up behind one political party or another.
You, of course, have researched and written extensively on Abraham Lincoln. I'm interested in two things about that chapter on Lincoln and the press. First, I'd like to talk about the partisan nature of the newspapers of the time. And of course, that was on full display. I have to talk about the Lincoln-Douglas debates being from Quincy.
Oh, you're right. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I'd like you to talk about that. And then secondly, I'm wondering about your opinion on Lincoln's justifications for shutting down newspapers, throwing journalists and other newspapermen in jail during the Civil War. So those two things of the chapter.
It's really three, but that's okay, because for Quincy, anything is possible.
That's of course.
Because you do have one of the best Italian restaurants in Illinois. So I'm going to be really, my friends in Quincy, including your former mayor, are going to be upset with me for not remembering the name of the restaurant.
Tiramisu.
Yes, I should remember that. It's a dessert. Yes, I've eaten there with Mayor Schultz and with Pat Souters, who is the chief of staff to Senator Durgan.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely.
I feel I have a Quincy connection. And my name is in the debate park, so I feel like at least Mayor Schultz made me an honorary citizen for a week anyway, which I cherish. So how did we start this one before we got into a rhapsody about Quincy? Oh, I know.
That's okay.
So the Lincoln-Douglas debate was transformative in terms of press coverage, and it really was because of Stephen Douglas, not Lincoln. Douglas arrived at the first debate in Ottawa, or at least he was prepping for it, when he learned that the Chicago Times, a Democratic newspaper, had hired a stenographer, a court stenographer, to come to Ottawa and all the debates and transcribe the speeches of the two candidates, Lincoln and Douglas, so they could be published in the Chicago Times and any other newspaper that wanted them. Well, as soon as the Republicans found out that this was happening, they hired a stenographer because they didn't want the Democratic version to be the official or the only version. And in fact, those transcripts were totally different. The Democratic transcripts were pretty brutal to Lincoln and made him sound kind of idiotic. And the Republican transcripts made Douglas sound even more racist than he was. And I say that with apologies to other people I know in Quincy who are experts on Stephen Douglas, like Reg Ankrum. I know so many people there. I've got to get them all in or I'm going to be in big trouble.
No, that's okay.
So that was transformative. And those transcripts were not only published in newspapers around the state and around the country, they introduced Lincoln to a national audience. And they ushered in a new way of covering, just as trials were being transcribed for the first time. Lincoln had a couple of cases that were transcribed, but only a couple. Political debate would never be the same again. People couldn't get away with saying things informally that they could deny later. So that was the big takeaway of the debates. Plus, Lincoln collected the Democratic transcripts of Douglas and the Republican ones of himself and had them published in a book.
Right. Engineered
their publication, and the book became a bestseller just at the start of the period, the run-up to the Republican National Convention of 1860. And I think when you add up all the little things that propelled Lincoln over his rivals to the top, the debates were one of them. It was all because of stenographers, in a way. So Lincoln grew up in an era of partisan newspapers. From his New Salem days, he was working for the Sangamo Journal, the precursor of the Illinois Journal, which was the Whig paper. He was selling subscriptions in New Salem. He was writing anonymous editorials. And in his 23 years in Springfield, he was closely allied with that paper. They printed his editorial. They supported every one of his endeavors. The Democratic Springfield paper was a thorn in his side, the Register. And so it was in every city, and, Quincy Whig and all of those things. Every town and city in Illinois had a Democratic and a Republican paper. So Lincoln grew up in politics, at least, feeling the blast from the Democratic press and feeling the love from the Republican press. Now, he was able to deal with it very successfully without resorting to the kind of anger and violence that characterized the era. And, Stephen Douglas got into a fight on the muddy streets of Springfield with the editor of the Republican paper. So there were moments that were pretty fraught. He gets to Washington, and there are several waves of the repression that he authorized. And remember, if we go strictly by the Constitution that forbade John Adams from enacting the Sedition Act, the Constitution does say that in times of rebellion, that the privilege of the writ of habeas corpus can be suspended. In effect, martial law can be enacted. So in the first instance, the first wave, in April and May of 1861, the Union Army shut down pro-secession newspapers in Missouri, in Kentucky, and in Maryland. And that was the first pushback. Anyone who was arguing for disloyalty, for insurrection, the word du jour, was subject to shutdown by the armed forces to prevent the state from leaving the Union. Then something happened in July 1861. In July, the Union lost the Battle of Bull Run, and also the first 90 and 100-day enlistments of Union soldiers began to lapse. And the Union faced an enlistment crisis. This is before the military draft. They had to get that army replenished if they were going to preserve the Union. When newspapers in New York City and elsewhere, but principally in New York, when Democratic newspapers began saying, why don't we just let the South go? It's not worth fighting over. The combination of forces, as has never been seen in this country, the Post Office Department, the State Department, the Interior Department, and the Army and the courts moved against New York newspapers. Now, New York was not headed towards secession, although the mayor of New York had talked about it for a while. So maybe Lincoln was worried about it. But that's when the crackdowns broke the boundaries of the secession, the border states, and morphed into the North. And through the whole Civil War, save for the kind of sacred period that Lincoln rendered for election campaigns, he thought that was kind of holy season. You couldn't interrupt those things with censorship. But save for that, Illinois, Indiana, Maine, Massachusetts states where you would expect union sentiment to be firm enough to withstand editorial criticism were all subject to newspaper shutdown. And they were not just about the survival of the country, but often purely political.
If we move forward a few decades, Theodore Roosevelt famously used the presidency as a bully pulpit.
Right.
But the level of communication that's required to do that, you need an understanding of how to effectively use the press. You also need an ability to foster an image, which of course he could do. Your accounts of the Barber's Hour were especially entertaining. Could you speak to Theodore Roosevelt's use and arrangements with the press?
Sure. Well, you can say that Roosevelt came to power at exactly the perfect time for him. It was the end, really, of political journalism. Newspaper reporters became more famous than the crusading editors like Horace Greeley. And it was an era of front-page journalism, often yellow in tint. And in that atmosphere, Roosevelt was the perfect person to cover it. He loved making news every single day. And if he wasn't, the famous story, he wanted to be the bride at every wedding and the corpse at every funeral and the baby at every christening. He also wanted to be on the front page every single day. If he wasn't happy.
Sounds like someone else.
It sounds like someone else. You talked about the Barber's Hour.
Sure.
One day at 1 p.m. when he was being shaved by his barber in the little room between the new Oval Office and the other rooms in the executive wing, he invited the journalists in. Roosevelt was a multitasker. He wasn't writing, he was reading and writing, and he could balance everything. He read a book a day, they say, which is pretty amazing. And exercising, of course, and walking and swimming and all of that stuff. So why not, while I'm getting a shave, that's boring. It's hard to read because I have to take my glasses off. So he called the reporters in from the White House press room, which he created for the first time. And they would ask him questions, and he would entertain them. And he, of course, it was all off the record unless he took it back on the record. You had to ask. Really, you had to do that through the Harry Truman era. Everything was off the record unless it was otherwise understood. And, the reporters thought it was a game after a while. They began a system where they would ask him the most difficult or challenging questions just as the barber held the straight-edge razor over Roosevelt's throat. Because he would always jump up and throw off the towel around his shoulders and slam it to the ground. And the barber would say, please, Mr. President, be careful. So it became a game. He never was cut, as far as we know. And, he invented trial balloons and all these things that we now are part of our vocabulary. He also invented the term bully pulpit and trial balloons. He not only did it, he coined the phrases. He's quite an extraordinary figure. And then spot photography comes in. So he's not only caricatured, but he's photographed on the move with his kids on vacation, hunting. So it's, again, you have to be the right person at the right time in order to succeed. And I argue that he was one of those. His cousin was another, and Kennedy and Obama and Trump, who just fell into they fell, leaping all the way, but they got to be president at a moment when they had mastered a certain culture and new technologies as well.
Now, throughout history, war has often resulted in crackdowns on the press.
Yes.
We've already talked about the Civil War, but George Creel and Woodrow Wilson's Committee on Public Information seem to take propaganda and censorship, at least in the American system, to another level.
Exactly. They say, by the way, that Joseph Goebbels studied George Creel's commission because Creel was not only in charge of sort of honor system censorship, that is, we don't discuss ships, we don't discuss troop movements. And this is World War I, of course. We don't discuss airplanes. We don't use the radio carelessly. But also, it was not just a negative campaign. It was a positive campaign. Creel organized the most extensive propaganda system in American history. It extended to press releases, special magazines, posters, those famous World War I recruitment posters by the great illustrators of the early 20th century.
Right.
And also mastery of the new medium of silent film. Not only films themselves, but also it was so specialized that they hired a bunch of specialists in something I've forgotten the time now, 60 or 90-second speeches. These were designed to be made at movie theaters during the intervals that were required to change the reels of early movies. And they would stand up and talk about America, the virtues of America and the evils of the Hun. And it was everywhere. Every aspect of American life was covered by Creel. We tend to focus on the censorship, and indeed, a few newspapers, socialist newspapers, the Jewish Daily Forward, were stopped in their tracks. But it was mostly this amazing propaganda machine that was functioning. And, Wilson, to his dying day, believed that it was an absolutely appropriate thing to do. Maybe it was, but at the same time, he was taciturn with the press corps itself and kept plenty of secrets from them. Can I tell you one quick Wilson story?
Absolutely.
That you didn't ask for?
Sure.
So, I couldn't, although the book is really long and I told a lot of stories in the book, I couldn't tell every story. And I thought, here's one that nobody will really care that much about, so I'll leave it out. I get to tell it, or I got to tell it, in a new preface to the paperback that's coming out in the late summer.
Okay.
So Wilson took a big press contingent to Europe, as President Biden has just done. This for the Versailles Conference to create the terms for the official surrender of Germany and the end of World War I. But once he got to Paris for the initial conferences, he kind of disappeared. And the press was clamoring to know where he was. Well, all they heard was that he was indisposed, he wasn't talking. And they never found out what had happened. And apparently what did happen is that he came down with a case of what was called the Spanish flu. It was considered to be a serious case. According to some, he was raving. He had kidney and prostate impact and, terrible hacking cough. And it, was teetering what way it would go. But he never told. So when I was ready to write the book, I said, I'd rather tell the story of how they hid the effects of his stroke a year later. Nobody is interested in a pandemic because we'll never have one again. So that was my rationale for leaving that story out.
Well, you did bring up that debilitating stroke, and I was wondering about that because Wilson, if I remember from the book, had the first organized news conferences.
Yes.
Yeah, they never really warmed to him, and I could see why. He wasn't as engaging as Theodore Roosevelt, for example. But how did he keep that so quiet? It seems such a serious and important event would have been reported on.
He was rushed back to Washington from the West Coast on a train, taken to the White House before anybody really knew what had happened. They just heard that he was taken ill, and then moved to an upstairs room where reporters it's not that they didn't report. They reported everything from terrible disability to a nervous breakdown. But nobody would confirm everything until a doctor began appearing before the press corps every day or two and saying, slight improvement. But no one ever found out what the exact nature was for a good long while. And then by the time they realized it had been a cerebral event, he was beginning to, sit on the White House porch with the shade carefully on the side of his face that had gone slack. No one heard him talk again for a long time. Yeah, it's hard to believe that it happened. Even in the early days of the 20th century, it was apparently possible to keep a giant secret like that a secret.
So mass communication in the age of radio. Nazi Germany actually provided radios to German citizens, and through Goebbels' propaganda efforts, and you just mentioned Goebbels just a second ago, they got their message out. Of course, it was a very sinister message, but effective.
Right.
At the exact same time, Franklin Roosevelt also seems to understand the importance of radio to get his message out.
Again, it's this extraordinary moment when the man and the moment meet. Roosevelt has a beautiful speaking voice. And unlike most politicians, and I've actually heard Wilson's voice and Teddy's voice. Teddy's is a pitch higher than Franklin's and probably would have sounded a little shrill. And Wilson was sort of had a growl, although he was supposedly an effective public speaker, not really harnessed for radio. And Harding and Hoover were not great on radio. But the sweetness in Roosevelt's voice, the modulation that he had practiced as governor of New York, suited this moment perfectly because although the government didn't distribute radios, I think they would have if they thought of it. It was the beginning of network radio, and the radio networks, NBC and CBS, ABC, and Westinghouse all formed. And people, they spent their last dollar to get this piece of furniture. I was even looking at there was a Laurel and Hardy silent movie about people buying a radio and having it repossessed in 1930 or 31. So every family, stretched its means to get these things, which were not just the kind of radios that I grew up with, which either transistors in your hand or something that sat on a table. These were pieces of furniture that dominated American parlors and living rooms. And Roosevelt, the day after he won the election in 1932, Herbert Hoover did not concede graciously or quickly and was waiting for results, and which is ridiculous because Roosevelt, I think, won 41 or 2 of the 48 states.
Right, yeah.
And it was an electoral and popular landslide. So Roosevelt was wheeled into the library of the building I work in, Roosevelt House, which was his home. And it was put in a chair in front of the fireplace and gave an address, a 1-minute radio address to the American people. And then the newsreel camera moved in, and he did a second take, better than the radio take, by the way. And he repeated it for this new phenomenon of newsreels, which was sweeping the country. And movies were never more popular than during the Depression. So next 12 years, 998 off-the-record news conferences, and only 28 fireside chats. And nonetheless, if you talk to people who survived the era or had the opportunity to do so, and, I talked to my parents loved Franklin Roosevelt, and they loved talking about him. They practically made him out to be the Judge Judy of his day. He was on every day. Every single day he was on the radio, which was not true. I mean, he was on more often than the fireside chats because he also did speeches. But it was a mastery of the medium that probably unparalleled in the complete conquest of news mediums.
It has been wonderful to me to catch the note of confidence from all over the country. I can never be sufficiently grateful to the people for the loyal support that they have given me in their acceptance of the judgment that has dictated our course, even though all our processes may not have seemed clear to them. After all, there is an element in the readjustment of our financial system more important than currency, more important than gold, and that is the confidence of the people themselves. Confidence and courage are the essentials of success in carrying out our plan. You people must have faith. You must not be stampeded by rumors or guesses. Let us unite in banishing fear. We have provided the machinery to restore our financial system, and it is up to you to support and make it work. It is your problem, my friends, your problem no less than it is mine. Together, we cannot fail.
Images of FDR show a man of vitality and calm, and he's almost always at the center of the picture. He's like projecting an image of a person that everybody wants to be around. It's reassuring, I guess, for the Great Depression and then the war after that.
Yeah.
But he's actually disabled. What is the arrangement that's made to keep that, I guess, quiet?
So I would have to say that until the eve of World War II, when the White House press office began much more aggressively enforcing what had really been a gentleman's agreement, that in fact it was a spontaneous effort by journalists, sort of just an unwritten code, that they would not photograph Franklin Roosevelt in a wheelchair or struggling to move his body forward. It used to be called struggling to walk, but it's now considered inartful and even politically incorrect to say that that's what he was doing, because he never really walked.
Right.
He could move his body if his sons were holding him or one son was holding him and he was using crutches and very heavy iron braces on his legs. It was heroic, to be sure, and, amazing effort. And they just wouldn't photograph it. And I looked in vain for some codification of this generosity, and I could not find it. I saw interviews with a few of the leading photographers who said things like, well, he was such a nice man and he was trying to help the country and we didn't want to throw any additional barriers in his way. Only later did the White House enforce it. Life magazine took a picture of him from a great distance being wheeled into Walter Reed Hospital to visit and aid. And press photographers were there after banned from military installations, naval as well as army. So they paid a heavy price for the indiscretion. But, if a Republican newspaper, and there still were, like the Chicago Tribune, was owned by a Roosevelt hater, sent a photographer to the White House and gave him express instructions, get a picture of that damn guy in a wheelchair. Well, if he took aim when the president was visibly in the wheelchair, one of the other photographers would just happen to smack him and jostle the camera at that moment. So it was an astonishing pact that lasted for a good 7 or 8 years before the White House began enforcing it and banning photographers who even took pictures that made Roosevelt look tired. They were very tough about it during the war. And remember also, Roosevelt had to be lifted in and out of cars.
Right.
He would jokingly say, "No pictures in the machine, boys," or "No pictures when I'm getting into the machine." And they respected it. It would never happen today, of course.
Never before, since Jamestown and Plymouth Rock, has our American civilization been in such danger as now. Frankly and definitely, there is danger ahead. Danger against which we must prepare. But we well know that we cannot escape danger or the fear of it by crawling into bed and pulling the covers over our heads. If Great Britain goes down, the Axis powers will control the continents of Europe and Asia and Africa and Australasia and the high seas. And they will be in a position to bring enormous military and naval resources against this hemisphere. It is no exaggeration to say that all of us in the Americas would be living at the point of a gun.
Speaking of image, President Kennedy provided a glamorous alternative to what, just to be fair, is kind of boring and conservative, which of course his predecessor was Dwight D. Eisenhower. The press appeared to, at the time, value that type of glamour and image. Maybe it was because of the age of television, I'm not sure. Presidential news conferences and press briefings, if you watch them today, they're entertaining.
Yeah.
The image that's cultivated through his pictures, even that were taken for newspapers or magazines, they stand the test of time. I mean, they're just iconic even today by today's media standards.
Yeah. Well, he was a very handsome guy. And I got to meet Robert Kennedy face to face.
Wow.
The night he won the United States Senate race in New York. And let me tell you, they had something. There was, those blue eyes and the twinkle and the hair. And it did it for me as a young activist in politics. So that was number one. Number two, he had a great voice also, and Eisenhower gets credit for doing the first live television news conference, but he did it they put it in a terrible location with a window behind him. All of us who've been doing Zooms for 15 months know that the light has to face you if it's behind you. It's refractive, and he had one of the best press secretaries in the history of the White House, Jim Haggerty, but he just didn't get the TV part. So Kennedy comes along and he hires the guy who did his makeup at the Nixon-Kennedy debates to design the backdrop. And they move it out of the White House and the executive office building where Ike had done it. And they do the new auditorium in the State Department, which has theater-style raked seating. And they design the now ubiquitous dark blue backdrop that every politician uses now in the country.
Mm-hmm.
And that was the color that they chose. The podium with the great seal of the presidency, that was an innovation that this designer thought of. There was no president that ever stood before the seal of the presidency for a photograph. So all of that, plus his charm and his wit and his knack. If you do listen, I recommend that people have an hour listen to one of the press conferences on the Kennedy Library website. He is very serious, but every once in a while, if it's dragging, he will be funny and he will call on this one woman, May Craig, who is a veteran going back to the Roosevelt press conferences, who will invariably ask a question that is completely off the topic of the day. And Kennedy will just have a retort, even if it's not so tough today, Ms. Craig. And people will erupt in laughter. It's like pent-up laughter. And that, began the, books about the wit and wisdom of Kennedy and Vaughn Meader and Impressionists who wrote albums about Kennedy's news conferences. I hope some of your listeners remember what albums are. I realize it's an ancient thing. But, absolutely revolutionized presidential communications. And once again, as with FDR and radio and TR to some degree with front page journalism, Kennedy had the right looks, the right voice, the right demeanor, and the glamour to just take over the television medium. And I will remind people that the print press did not like the press conferences at the start. They thought it was theatrical. They thought it wasn't challenging enough. They thought it was bowing to Kennedy's strengths without scrutiny. They wrote quite critically of it. One person wrote it was like watching Kennedy make love in Carnegie Hall. And they wanted to control it, but they lost control. Now, they could have had their revenge if they had written frankly about Kennedy's extramarital affairs or his bad health.
Right.
But according to the Roosevelt tradition, they didn't do it. And they knew about the fooling around in the White House. Maybe they were impressed by the Olympian nature of it, but they certainly didn't cover it. And they admitted later in the memoirs, oh, yes, we knew, but we thought it had nothing to do with his public performance. Maybe not the best choice of words, but you know what I'm saying.
Right. Yes, of course.
I think it was because they liked him. And then when a guy like Nixon Johnson and Nixon, whom they tend not to like, it's almost like they released all their pent-up hostility, curiosity, and investigative chops on them. And that's been the culture since.
I have selected as the title of my remarks tonight, The President and the Press. Some may suggest that this would be more naturally worded, the President versus the press, but those are not my sentiments tonight. It is true, however, that when a well-known diplomat from another country demanded recently that our State Department repudiate certain newspaper attacks on his colleagues, it was unnecessary for us to reply that this administration was not responsible for the press, for the press had already made it clear that it was not responsible for this administration.
Nixon had to see all of that. And of course, he's a very different man than JFK, but he witnessed the way the press treated Kennedy, and he was never going to get that treatment. By the end of his presidency, though, it's moved past vindictiveness or pettiness to an abuse of power.
Yeah.
As he used the position of the presidency to investigate or intimidate or obfuscate the press. Many actually showed up on his enemies list. So what was Nixon's relationship with the press?
Well, it had been bad from the very beginning of a career that started really in the 1940s. He believed that he never got credit for his anti-communist activities, for his Alger Hiss case, which was always the highlight of his life if he was asked. It's interesting. He went around the press in 1952 when he was accused of hiding a slush fund. He decided not to explain it to the press, but to take a cue from Kennedy's playbook before there was a Kennedy playbook. And he went on television. He had to buy the network time, and he wouldn't let the press in the room. And he did his now famous or infamous Checker speech, in which he talked about buying a dog and his wife wearing a cloth coat, and would have been dumped from the Eisenhower ticket had he not done it successfully. So he actually did have skills. But again, the tendency to be hostile to the press overrode everything. And after he lost the presidency, and then lost the governorship of California in a comeback bid in 1962 to Jerry Brown's father, he held a news conference in which he notoriously said, "You won't have Nixon to kick around anymore because this is my last press conference." And then he went on to blame the press for his defeat in California. So comes to the presidency with this amazing comeback, and rather than revel in it, he continues with all of the old antipathies and hostilities and anger that he had for all these years, and sends Spiro Agnew out to castigate the press in the first years of his administration. Remember the nattering nabobs of negativity.
I have never heard or seen such outrageous, vicious, distorted reporting in 27 years of public life. I'm not blaming anybody for that, but when people are pounded night after night, with that kind of frantic, hysterical reporting, it naturally shakes their confidence. And yet, don't get the impression that you arouse my anger. You see, one can only be angry with those he respects.
Now, I'd like to move ahead to George W. Bush, because there were times where he was very harshly criticized, maligned, even made fun of, and the press had a role in that. But unlike Nixon and Trump even, he doesn't openly attack the press. I'd like to give him a little credit, though, because he often would indicate how important the press was to democracy.
He did.
Now in his post-presidency, he has a resurgence. He almost comes off as extremely likable. I wonder if this is a lesson for other presidents. Don't get too angry.
Jimmy Carter had to live down a lot of hostility to the press, by the way. He fought with the press, as did his press office at every turn. And he had to be an exceptionally generous and philanthropically minded ex-president to regain, credit in the American mind, if not as a leader, then at least as a nice and good guy. Because when he left office, he was not considered either. And it's taken him, 95 or 96 years of life to have that stature.
Right.
Bush is a very likable guy, I find. And, I've met him quite a few times, and he's been very, very generous to me, I must say. I don't share his politics, and it didn't matter to him in terms of being kind about my Lincoln work and letting me speak in the White House and giving me the National Humanities Medal. So I'm endlessly grateful to him for crossing, not being concerned about party affiliation. But I think the press always liked him. He made some terrible mistakes with the press. Playing a guitar, an electric guitar during a hurricane that's devastated New Orleans, not a great idea. But he was always fairly straightforward with the press. In my paperback edition, I print some of his, something I should have done originally, his farewell press conference to the media. And he says, basically, you guys may have misunderestimated me, using one of those malaprops that he had been attacked for using. So he threw it back at them. And again, he said, you and I, you've traveled the world with me, and you've been in this house with me, and we haven't agreed on everything, but I respect you, and I respect your ability and your right to tell the story as you want to. It was a very gracious goodbye, very similar to the goodbye that Barack Obama had in his farewell press conference, even though he left some bitter taste in the mouths of some journalists for some wiretapping things, which we're now hearing about. It was a nice tradition while it lasted, and it didn't last very long. The Bush and Obama farewell news conferences. So obviously Donald Trump did not do that. I'm not even sure he did a farewell of any kind, but
yeah, right.
He certainly didn't do a news conference.
I consider the media to be indispensable to democracy. That we need an independent media to hold people like me to account. I mean, power can be very addictive, and it can be corrosive, and it's important for the media to call to account people who abuse their power, whether it be here or elsewhere. One of the things I spent a lot of time doing was trying to convince a person like Vladimir Putin, for example, to accept the notion of an independent press. And it's kind of hard to, tell others to have an independent free press, and we're not willing to have one ourselves.
So you mentioned President Obama, and he received pretty good press coverage for the most part. His White House Correspondents' Dinners, you can listen to them now, and they're very classic. Do you think that favorable coverage, though, gave rise or empowered the more conservative outlets as they used it as evidence to say, see, we told you that this mainstream media has a true bias?
I think that's a really great question. All your questions have been great, but this one is particularly great because I don't know if I've thought about it in quite those terms. It could very well be. Remember, the so-called conservative media, and certainly in radio, has just grown exponentially since the early Clinton days in reaction to him, the demonization that they decided he deserved. But with Obama, I think it was issues-driven, maybe a little bit racist. But I also think I tend to agree with you that if you look at some of the quotes in my book, journalists were very unhappy with Obama, particularly when he created the White House website and told journalists that's where you should go for information, not to me. Particularly after wiretaps were instituted against journalists who were accused of taking leaked information, if that sounds familiar.
Yes.
'Twas ever thus. But until Obama, we don't know if there were any wiretaps in peacetime. Of course, you could also say that we haven't been in peacetime for 20 years, but that's the excuse that Obama gave. But there were lots of complaints about his being the most abusive in terms of press relations, and that was obviously before the fighting with Trump began a few months after the 2016 election. But yeah, it's very possible that the good press he got fomented the idea that liberal presidents get favorable press. I would only say that he didn't get favorable press on Fox. He didn't get favorable press in any of the Murdoch-owned newspapers. And he is a historic figure who deserves acknowledgement simply for doing what nobody thought was possible, and that's becoming the first black elected president.
Even when you complained about my long answers, I just want you to know that the only reason they were long was because you asked 6-part questions. But I have enjoyed working with all of you. That does not, of course, mean that I've enjoyed every story that you have filed, but that's the point of this relationship. You're not supposed to be sycophants. You're supposed to be skeptics. You're supposed to ask me tough questions. You're not supposed to be complimentary, but you're supposed to cast a critical eye on folks who hold enormous power and make sure that we are accountable to the people who sent us here. And you have done that. And you've done it, for the most part, in ways that I could appreciate for fairness, even if I didn't always agree with your conclusions.
So moving ahead to President Trump, he spent a lifetime wooing the press and cultivating a brand. That's pretty much what he did. He knows how to remain in the national consciousness. He's got an ability for that.
Absolutely.
He's from the baby boom generation, but somehow he figures out how to use Twitter, for example, to maintain that image in the national consciousness.
Well, he's right there. He's right there on the dawn of Twitter. I would love to know. I was unable to find out. Trump is not a person who credits. He doesn't take advice from doctors, from scientists, from diplomats. He knows better than everybody, from the Army. And I would love to know which of the aides that came up to him when he was a civilian and said, we have this thing called Twitter, and you're going to be on the David Letterman show tonight and do your 10 best something list. So let's put it on Twitter. And he says, this is the guy who didn't even do email.
Right.
He had his emails printed out in these days. So he said, okay, what the heck? Print it, write it and show it to me and we'll post it. And by the time he left, he had, I know this irks him, almost as many Twitter followers as Barack Obama. He doesn't have as many. I think now he has none, but he had, I think, 65 million to Obama's 80 million at one point. And those are, imagine the power. You don't need the press.
Right.
As I say in my book, I think the worst failing of the press during the first 3 years of the Trump administration is that it not only, it couldn't counter the power of the social media, but it let social media lead every story.
Yeah.
So Trump would tweet from God knows what room at 6 a.m, and by 8 o'clock, CNN, Fox, and MSNBC and all of the morning shows were focused on his tweet. It was a good tweet. It was a bad tweet. It was a smart tweet. It was a stupid tweet. It was a provocative tweet. It was a racist, whatever. That was the story. Trump, you'd think that if he did it for a week, the television people and the print people would realize that he was playing them. But they never realized it until the campaign season began for 2020. So it was very clever of him indeed, and very effective in terms of creating, nationalizing this brand of being an impatient, bellicose person who translated that into just what the country needed, he said, and convinced enough people that it was true. So, yeah, amazing savvy about that medium.
The other thing is his detractors and political enemies always seem to underestimate him. He's dumb. He's a failure. He's a fraud. He's lazy. When they do that, they underestimate the skill he actually does have, and they do it at their own peril.
Absolutely. And, if he says he's still in control of the Republican Party and he'll be back, I don't know, I don't think he'll be back in August, but I think he'll be back in some form. And I think, even those of us who knew Trump in New York long enough to hate him when he was here will concede one thing, should concede one thing in terms of the history of the president and the press, that he would have been the most visible and influential ex-president in American history. He may still be so today, but the mediums that he came to dominate had to throw him off their platforms in order to silence him and to quell the power that he had. And that, in a way, is a tribute to his mastery of those mediums. They had to toss him off. And, of course, that's never happened in the history of the United States. Even anti-war Franklin Pierce and James Buchanan were allowed to complain, and Martin Van Buren were allowed to complain during the early days of the Civil War. Trump has been silenced. And it's a story that we'll be writing about for a long time, what the meaning of that is.
You see, he said he was going to ask a very simple, easy question. And it's not. it's not a simple question, not a fair question. Okay, sit down. I understand the rest of your question. So here's the story, folks. Number one, I am the least anti-Semitic person that you've ever seen in your entire life. Number two, racism, the least racist person. In fact, we did very well relative to other people running as a Republican. Quiet, quiet, quiet. See, he lied about he was going to get up and ask a very straight, simple question. So, it's welcome to the world of the media.
So my final question for you is, what's in store for us in the future? Is it more partisanship or tribalism? Or after you've done your book and you've looked into it, is it cyclical? And will we return once again to a time where there's more objective journalism and press coverage?
I don't think it's cyclical so much as, it's cyclical in terms of very long cycles. I think we're in a very long cycle that started in the Clinton days, really, partisan journalism. I think television journalism is kind of lost. Maybe not the networks, but the networks don't have that much relevance.
Right.
Those 6 p.m. broadcasts, 6:30, 7, whatever they are not as consequential as they were when I was a kid and we turned on Walter Cronkite and he spoke to, 100 million people at once. It's fractured, it's fragmented, it's very partisan. CNN and MSNBC have totally different take than Fox. But I think they're going to matter less as people find alternative means to get the news. And I think, one thing we know of that there will be something coming in the future technologically that we can't predict now that's going to shake everything up again. I'm just afraid that what's been happening in recent years is fragmentation. And I think Joe Biden was speaking about that effectively the other day, I think from England, when he talked about the silos that we're all in terms of getting information. It's very hard to commit to national purpose if, half of the media criticizes everything that Donald Trump does and half of the media contradicts everything that Joe Biden does.
Right.
Surely there must have been things that each of them did that the media could have agreed to comment favorably on. I mean, America did produce a vaccine in record time under Donald Trump, even if he couldn't successfully distribute it. Biden got it distributed, in a manner that Trump couldn't accomplish. So there are moments when I think the common weal, the common good requires us to pull together. I don't know if it can happen again, but I think it's what we need.
Well, thank you very much. The book, like all of your work, is very well researched. It's excellent. And I would encourage everyone to get a copy. And you said that the paperback's coming out soon?
Yes, with a new preface that, judging from our conversation today, is already out of date. I should keep it going on a website, keep updating it, because so much has happened since I shut it down. It was really the early days of Joe Biden. But it's a fascinating sport, watching the presidents and the press jousting and looking at Vladimir Putin this day that we're taping, do an interview, you realize how chilling it is when a real tyrant is dealing with a press that he'd rather not deal with.
Yes.
So thank goodness we have the system we have today.
Right, definitely. Well, thank you once again. We're going to have to get you back to Quincy, though.
I was going to say it, but you were gracious enough to say it. So I'm going to make sure that all of my Quincy friends listen to this podcast. And it's a great town. And I know your listeners are beyond the borders, but it would be nice to come back. It would be nice to go anywhere, frankly. But Quincy is on my list.
Well, that's fantastic. And thank you once again.
Well, thank you. It's been fun talking to you. Thanks for these really good questions.
I would like to thank my guest today, the distinguished Lincoln scholar and prolific writer, Harold Holzer. And if you would like to get his book, The President versus the Press, The Endless Battle Between the White House and the Media, from the Founding Fathers to Fake News, all you have to do is click on the link in the description below. Of the book, Kirkus says, a shrewd history of the fight to convey and repress objective truth. And this book is truly a well-researched and fabulous read. The featured brew was Freedom of Press Session Sour from Revolution Brewery of Chicago, Illinois. If you liked our talk today, please share this episode with a friend. And remember to subscribe to the podcast. It's the only way, as I mentioned before, to get those newest episodes right away. For more information on episodes, topics, and authors, like the History A Go-Go Facebook page. The music was provided by the North Carolina band Bones Fork, and their link is in the description below as well. Once again, thank you to all of the listeners and supporters. And if you have a suggestion on a topic or an author you would like me to speak to, just leave a message on the History A Go-Go Facebook page. If I use your suggestion, you'll get a shout out on that episode. There are many more great episodes on the way, with discussions on JFK and baseball, the inherent strangeness of the Bible, and the conquest of Alexander the Great. So join us again next time when we talk, think, and drink on History A Go-Go.
Around the world, the regions where we see the most strife and the most conflict almost always are those that are divided along ethnic and religious lines. And where there's division, too often there's a ripe ground for extremists to sow havoc.